Good morning. It's Reverend Mike Cape from the First Presbyterian Church of Elmwood Park. Our Bible text this morning is Isaiah 53, 2 through 6. He grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. We Christians assert that Isaiah is talking about Jesus here. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him, Jesus, the iniquity of us all. Sounds our reading. Well, we have spent a lot of time in this sermon series talking about how a God that is transcendent, a God that is beyond the imminent, immediate reality that we see in front of us, how that God can enter into our world, affect it, redeem it, love us. Lots of cultures have imagined a God entering the world. Many of them we might call pagan, those who worship Greek and Roman gods. Also, those Canaanites who worshipped Baal, Asherah, Moloch, and enticed Israel to do the same in the Old Testament. By and large, these pagan gods and goddesses, they're larger than life, endued with superhuman power and appetites, but not susceptible to human pain and suffering. We Christians, on the other hand, assert that there is an all-powerful God, vastly more powerful than any of these pagan pretenders. And what does that God do? That God becomes incarnate as an ordinary human baby. That God becomes vulnerable. That God suffers. Really, no other religion has imagined such a thing in this way. It is quite unique to us. Jesus, he was the God who became man, yet he didn't look godlike or even superhuman. He was not especially good looking that we should take notice of him. And he was truly a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. That is the message of the cross, that God sent his only begotten Son out of love to save us, and that this God, Son of God, in a mysterious Trinitarian way, is actually God himself, and that God died. So in essence, we have a God of sorrows and acquainted with grief. A God who is like us, for we experience sorrows, and no one lives in this life without becoming acquainted with grief. And this brings us back to Was, the young man at the hypothetical composite church, St. John the Baptist, whose story is told in Andy Root's book, Churches in the Crisis of Decline, a Hopeful Ecclesiology for the Secular Age. We've been following Was, and last week we talked about the breakthrough he had as he heard the testimony given by his grandmother Jean way back in 1947, where Jean shared about how lost she felt after her husband was killed in the war, and how in her lostness, God had found her. Was got it. He understood that he couldn't find God, but the God who is God could find him once he was truly lost. And they relearned the church's watchword. Jesus is the finder of what is lost, and God makes a way where there is no way. While all this was happening, Waz's friendship with the old musician Herbert was growing closer. You remember that Woz had been taking him to his doctor's appointments. Herbert and Woz played a concert for the Wednesday Bible study that knocked their socks off, bringing great vitality and joy. When the winter service project to work on habitat houses rolled around, Woz signed up. Young adult Woz and elderly Herbert sat next to each other most of the weekend, laughing and joking like two middle school boys. They played their guitars late into the night. Helene finally yelled at them at 1 a.m. on Sunday to shut up. Herbert busted out in mischievous laughter. He told some folks at breakfast that he hadn't felt that naughty or alive in years. It felt so good to get in trouble, he told them, to their delight. Herbert spent most of the rest of the next day fighting to stay awake, and Woz giggled at him as he did. They were thick as thieves. It gave everyone great joy to see this true friendship. It continued in this vein for a couple of more months until Bert got a message that Herbert had been hospitalized for pneumonia. And just like that, no one could find Woz. Woz was MIA. He'd been missing in action for a while. No one had heard from him since Herbert was hospitalized. Bert had called and left a detailed message. He told Woz that Herbert was in a bad way. Herbert had asked for Woz and wanted to see him, but there was nothing. Woz missed Bible study and nobody could reach him. He had never missed a Bible study since he started coming after his grandmother's funeral. Back in the summer, Woz joked that he owed them those not quite old day donuts. And even when he felt like taking a break, he brought them. But now there were no donuts and no Woz. His absence was like a throbbing deficit, and its connection to Herbert seemed obvious. In the next few days, Helene called countless times, Sue texted, finally Bert went searching. Bert made his way to Teddy's Tacos on trivia night. Woz might have missed Bible study, but Bert figured he'd never be absent from trivia night. But he wasn't there. Woz's team told Bert they hadn't heard anything from Woz for a while either. Woz normally dropped into Teddy's a couple of times a week, grabbing a taco for lunch or dinner. He often gabbed with Teddy, his old high school acquaintance, about new music or even investments. But Teddy, too, told Bert that Woz hadn't been in, not even once, in the last week. Bert drove to Woz's place. He knocked and looked through the windows. There was no motion, but a few lights were on. So Bert decided to wait, sitting on a wobbly old kitchen chair on the Dusty's 1930s porch. It badly needed a coat of paint. Bert could spot multiple coats that had been painted on top of other coats over the decades. It smelled like dust and oranges. About 40 minutes later, Woz came biking up. When he reached the porch, the dusty orange smell was covered by what Bert was pretty sure was weed. Woz's eyes were red. At first, Bert figured it was the weed, and it might have been. But soon Bert realized how much pain Woz was in. It had been a week of tears. Woz was distant at first. But when Bert caught his eye and said, "I know how hard this is," Woz's distance retreated. And Bert saw the same honest, hurting guy he'd met for the first time in the sanctuary after Woz's grandmother's funeral. Woz told Bert that he didn't think he could do it all again. He couldn't lose someone who'd become so important to him. The loss of Grandma Jean still hurt too badly. Hearing about Herbert's hospitalization had felt too much the same, adding to his pain. So Woz had gone back to hiding, cutting himself off from everyone, retreating into himself. The pain made him wonder if this journey for God was a waste of time. Bert listened. And Bert reminded Woz of their watchword. If it wasn't for you, Woz, we as a church would never have gotten back to looking to find Jesus in what's lost. Because where there is no way, God makes a way. Remember that, Woz? I know, Woz said. "It's been running through my head. I just thought the hard stuff was behind me. I thought those words were for making sense of what already happened, not for preparing me for what was going to happen." "But that's life, Woz. This is living. It hurts, but there's a beauty in it all." Bert and Woz talked for another hour, and the next day, Woz visited Herbert. We're going to leave that for 2 weeks from today. So Woz is a Christ figure in this story. His heart is broken over the pain of someone he loves. Jesus is like that. He sees our pain and his heart is broken. He knows a lot of our pain is self-inflicted. That's okay. He will shoulder the burden, pay the price. He also knows that much of our pain is not our fault. Life brings joy, life brings pain. You pretty much can't have one without the other. And so, like Jesus, Woz is a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Bert is also a Christ figure in this story. Bert goes to seek and save the lost, to bring comfort and solace. Bert goes the extra mile, checking everywhere to find Woz. Finally, he plops himself down on the old chair on Woz's porch and waits. Like the father of the prodigal son, he waits, patiently watching for the lost young man to come home. And when he comes, Bert is welcoming, gentle, loving, yet reminding Woz of what Woz already knows about God. Bert is like Jesus to Woz in that moment. And isn't that our goal as Christians, to become like Jesus? We can't be Jesus, of course, but through the power of the Holy Spirit, through a lifetime of worship, prayer, and service, we can in many ways become like him. Now, I also identified Woz as a Christ figure. I stand by that assessment. In his pain, Woz has that essential quality of our humanity that Jesus also experiences, despite Jesus being God incarnate. But Woz is not yet a Christ figure for Herbert. Please note that I said yet. That was a bit of foreshadowing for the next sermon in our series 2 weeks from today. But today, in this part of the story, Woz has been overcome by his pain. He is not yet ready to be the church, conveying God's message of redemption to broken and hurting people. He's getting close, but he isn't there yet. As I was thinking about Woz in this moment, I got to thinking about Jesus' disciples in that brief span of time between his death on the cross and the moment that they get really clear that the resurrection happened and what it implied. They are on the cusp of becoming Christ figures for their whole world, but they don't know it yet. The pain of his death is still too overwhelming, and there's a lot of confusion. On the very Sunday of Easter, 2 of them decide to get out of Dodge. They exit Jerusalem and head toward the village of Emmaus. One of them is named Cleopas. The other one is never named. Could be anyone. Maybe Mike. Today I'll think of him as Woz. And I will end this sermon by reading and commenting on this famous story from Luke 24. Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with one another, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Notice that sometimes Jesus is around when we don't know that he's around. He asked them, "What are you 2 discussing together as you walk?" They stood still, their faces downcast, sad. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Notice that Jesus knows more about our life than we think he does. What things, he actually asks, despite the fact that it all happened to him. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. What is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us they'd seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But they did not see Jesus. Jesus, that they don't know is Jesus, said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Would have loved to be there for that talk. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued as if he were going on farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." And so he went in to stay with them. Notice that Jesus comes and goes as he pleases, but he likes to be invited. When he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Sadly, it is possible for our hearts to be burning and us to be unaware of it until after. Perhaps that would be a good prayer, that we are awake enough to notice when holy things are happening around us in future. So they got up in the dark, having walked the 7 miles to where they were and walked the 7 miles back to Jerusalem. Sometimes you have to do something extravagant for Jesus, and sometimes you're just so filled with energy you can't not do it. When they got back, they found the 11 and those with them assembled together. Everybody was saying, "It is true. The Lord is risen and has appeared to Simon." And the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Notice that we are not the center of the universe, that God has been working with other people besides us, even when we feel his presence. And I read one last verse as a little benediction, I guess. When they were still talking about this, suddenly Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." That's it for today, my friends. May peace be with you. Amen.